Welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I'm with, in person, Liz Jackson, who's been on the channel a bunch. I've also had an in-person interview with you already a couple years ago at this point on, was it just faith and rationality?
Yeah, it's kind of fun to bring it back full circle and do another in-person interview. So,
I know,
yeah.
and today we're talking about the axiology of theism, and that's a really fancy way of saying, we're just asking the question, should you want God to exist?
Exactly.
Right, do I have all this right?
Yeah. So axiology means value. So another way to think about it is, what would the value of God's existence be? Would it be a good thing? Would it be a bad thing? Would it be a neutral thing? And then that has implications for whether we should want God to exist.
Okay,
so
let's talk about, I guess, to start things off, let's talk about like a non-theistic, something that has value. So like, I don't know, you just got married recently, or you had some wedding receptions recently, so like a diamond ring has value. Should you want a diamond ring? Is that kind of like how should we think about it like that?
I mean, you can think about it like that, and you could say that the questions might come apart in some cases of whether it would be good that God exists or whether it's valuable that God exists, and then whether we should want God to exist.
Okay.
However, I think one way that people at least generally kind of think about things is beliefs aim at the truth and desires aim at the good. So you want your beliefs to be true and you want to desire things that are good. So if it were a good thing that God existed, if it were a valuable thing that God existed, then at least a lot of us, you might think, should value and desire God to exist.
Yeah, no, that's a good distinction between desire and belief.
Yeah.
And I kind of just like want to stop the interview and just think about that for like 10 minutes, but I can't. Okay, so where should we start with this question? Like, what's a good place to set a foundation?
So I like to kind of back up when I introduce this and sort of talk about three big questions you might have when thinking about philosophy of religion. So the first, probably a super familiar one, is what you might call the ontology of theism. So that's just the question of whether God exists or not. And that's where, the fine-tuning and cosmological and ontological arguments would come in, and the problem of evil and hiddenness. These are debates that are relevant to the ontological question. The second question, and the question that I've done quite a bit of work on, is what you might call the epistemological question. Mm-hmm. So that's the question of whether we should believe that God exists. Is it rational to believe in God? And I've talked about faith, Pascal's wager, all that stuff. So I think in philosophy of religion, those two questions, they've gotten quite a bit of attention. Mm-hmm. But this is why I think the axiological question is so interesting, because it is kind of a natural third question. Should we want God to exist? Could it be rational to desire God's existence? And I think that question, there's been a little bit of literature on it, but significantly less than the ontological and the epistemological question. So I think that's kind of a helpful way to set it up. Does God exist? Should we believe in God? And then should we desire God?
These different distinctions are really helpful. Yeah, the ontological question, the epistemological question, and then the axiological question.
Yeah.
And it's really about this desire component, should we want God to exist.
Yep.
The reason why I like this distinction is because, there's something that gets brought up a lot by atheists and skeptics, is that Christians just want Christianity to be true, and that's like almost a reason to be skeptical. It's like we should be skeptical when our desires are for something that's true. Like we should be skeptical of that, right?
Yeah.
Because our desires lead us astray so often. So, should we be so skeptical just in virtue of the fact that we do want this to be true?
Yeah, I think I see what they're saying, but I don't totally agree. So I do think, wishful thinking isn't rational.
Right.
And if our evidence just clearly points to atheism, it's 99% likely God doesn't exist, but we're just kind of like, well, I want God to exist, so forget that or whatever, and then you choose to believe in God. You could say, at least from an epistemic perspective or from a perspective of what's called evidentialism, which means you should proportion your beliefs to the evidence, that seems irrational, right? But I think there's two things you can say here. One is thinking about a case where your evidence doesn't clearly point to atheism, but your evidence is maybe more ambiguous, or maybe it's balanced between theism and atheism. And I think in a case like that, if there's kind of like what you might call an epistemic tie, then I think you could go with the desirable hypothesis, at least as far as your evidence is in this position where it's tied. But I also think, even if your evidence does point to atheism, desires come into play when thinking about how you should act, the rationality of action. And there are a lot of cases, we even talked about some of these actually in our last in-person interview, where something's unlikely, but because of your desires, it's actually rational to act on that thing. And I think in that interview, I gave an example of your brother who goes missing, and it becomes increasingly likely that he's dead or gone forever or whatever. But because it would be such a good thing if you did find him, you continue to act as if he's still alive. And so it could be kind of like an action-oriented consideration. Even if desires don't affect what you should believe, they could affect how you should act.
I think about when it comes to that question of like, should we just be skeptical of stuff that we want to be true? I mean, to me, it's like kind of you've got to take everything case by case.
Yeah.
You can't, especially with something like that, you can't just like stop. Like, okay, you want this thing to be true, therefore you should just be skeptical and withhold belief in that thing. You know, because it case by case basis, there's counterexamples to that. Just like, you know, I desire food, I desire red curry for lunch, you know, and that doesn't mean that I should be skeptical of the existence of red curry. Right?
Absolutely.
So
it depends on your evidence. Yeah.
So sometimes your desires can line up with the truth, and so it's got to be like a case by case basis. You can't just apply this skeptical principle broadly to every situation where you desire something.
There's tons of things that we both believe are true and we want to be true. Like that your wife is an awesome lady. Like you both believe that and you want it to be true. And it would be totally silly to think that everything we want to be true, that somehow like gives us evidence that it's false or it's unlikely. I mean, and again, like I get what they're saying, like you want to be careful you're not engaging in wishful thinking and believing something that's super unlikely, but at the same time, you take it way too far if like desire just automatically gives us reason to be skeptical.
Yeah, I guess if I want to be like maximally charitable to this view, most people are sort of scared of death and scared of like the unknown and what happens, and also, when you lose someone that you love and you want to see them again, and that's one of the things that's kind of driving this desire for theism to be true, or for Christianity in particular to be true, because Christianity teaches that we're going to be resurrected and spend time with everyone for eternity. So there are these different, I think elements that are sort of really deep and fundamental to us, and maybe that's what the skeptic is kind of getting at, is that like, those things, it seems really easy to see why someone would desire that even if it's false. And so did I add anything, or is the response going to be different to that? I mean,
I think what you're kind of doing, so in the axiology, I'll back up for a second. In the axiology of theism, there's basically two positions. And there's a few others, but the two main ones are pro-theism, the view that God's existence would be a good thing, or we should want God to exist, and then anti-theism, which is the view that God's existence would be a bad thing, or we should not want God to exist, or even positively desire that God not exist. And what you're kind of doing is you're basically saying there's some strong considerations in favor of pro-theism. We get to see our loved ones again. There's an afterlife. There's ultimate justice in the afterlife, at least on a lot of versions of theism, right? And so, but here's a really interesting thing, which is pro-theism and anti-theism actually totally cross-cut the theism-atheism debate, right? So just because pro-theism is true doesn't give us reason to think theism's false, right? And in fact, like might even be natural to both believe in God and think God's existence would be a good thing.
This is super helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, so
cool.
So going back to the distinction between the ontological question and the axiological question, you can still accept, and I think that's kind of like what I was just getting at, is that there are some good reasons to desire that theism is true. So maybe this question is almost like assuming a good answer to this question is that theism is something that we should desire to be true. But then, it's a completely separate question. I think that's kind of what we arrived at a little bit earlier, is that it's a separate question once we start to look at the evidence, whether something or not is true. And then a completely separate question from that is, what's the appropriate course of action to take with respect to some proposition? So that's super helpful.
Cool.
Okay, where should we go from here? So maybe discuss some different arguments pro-theism and anti-theism.
Yeah, so there's a lot to be said here, and we don't have forever, but a couple considerations in favor of pro-theism, and some of them that I'm actually talking about at this conference, I think a lot of them have to do with the way that God brings about justice and redeems evils. So a really big one would be that if theism is true, either there's no gratuitous or pointless evil, or there's like a lot less. So if atheism is true, lots of evil things happen. A lot of them are pointless, and we don't really have any guarantee that justice is going to be served, or people that are wronged are going to be somehow compensated or whatever. But if theism is true, then there's probably a lot less gratuitous evil, especially if God's both all-powerful and all-good. And I think a lot of theists think there's maybe even no gratuitous evil at all. All evil has some purpose in God's ultimate plan.
I like that you're leaving room open for, some theists have argued that God's existence is compatible with some evils being pointless.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And so you're being sensitive to that. I respect that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so Peter Van Inwagen has this view in which God has to pick a world and there is no greatest possible world, and so as long as God picks a world above some threshold of goodness, that's permissible. And so depending on what you mean by gratuitous evil, that could be a view on which there's some gratuitous evil.
Isn't Mike Almeida another philosopher who's argued?
I'm less familiar with his argument, but yeah, I think that sounds right. That rings a bell.
Yeah, there's a number of theists that have argued that. It's super interesting. I think Jordan Hampton has actually had someone on to discuss that as well.
So Klaas Cray is actually one of my colleagues, and he does a bunch of work on the Axiology of Theism, but also he's done work on gratuitous evil as well. He's a great philosopher. People should go check out his work if they haven't.
I feel like we're getting too much on a tangent here. But
sorry.
So this is one aspect, right, of like something that we should want. One reason why we should be pro-theist.
Yep.
Pro-theism.
Yep.
What's the correct term? Pro-theist or pro-theism?
Yeah, so it would be pro-theism is the view that God's existence is a good thing, and then you're a pro-theist if you think God's existence is a good thing, or you desire for God to exist, or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, so
that's one consideration.
That's a big one. I'm trying to think of some others. I mean, another one, which is going to be pretty controversial, but some people have argued that God is, there's different ways of putting it, but the best way to ground morality, the only way to ground morality, that's very controversial, or maybe more weakly, the best explanation for why we should be motivated to act morally. And so if you think that God is related to morality in one of these ways, whether that's the only way to ground morality, the best way, or even just a way to explain why we should be motivated to act morally, then I think you can both explain how we get moral truths and then also why we should care about those moral truths. And so you would have to then argue that the atheist can't give a similar story, but that's another sort of way you could motivate pro-theism.
Why don't we just run through like a list of all the different things that are pro-theism in your view, and then and also just mention if any of these are controversial. Like
absolutely.
If there's disagreement between people.
Yeah, so I think there's going to be a lot that sort of relate to that problem of evil thing I said first. So I'm just going to kind of lump a bunch of those together.
Would justice fall into that category?
Cosmic justice. Wrongs are righted. I think. Evildoers are held accountable. All of that, no gratuitous evil, you could kind of put that under the problem of evil. I think that's a pretty weighty one.
You could even do like compensation for, past suffering in your life could fall under that. And that would be a good thing, compensation in terms of like, you've got this afterlife that theism sort of either entails or is part of theism.
Yep, absolutely. So that's kind of a category, but I think that's pretty weighty and has a lot of components to it.
Okay.
So for me, that's a pretty big consideration in favor of pro-theism. There's the morality stuff. And then I think a third one that I think is significant is this idea that if God exists, God's loving, God's powerful, and God wants a relationship with creatures, then God's going to, and this kind of comes from some of the divine hiddenness stuff, so we're kind of borrowing a premise from that argument. But the idea is that if this kind of God exists, God's going to make himself available to people. He's going to reveal himself in certain ways, and he's going to make it so that as long as you're not resistant, you're not sort of blinding yourself or resistant to having a relationship with God, you can see that God's there. You can see that God exists. So God's going to do God's part in revealing himself and basically making space for there to be a relationship with God. And so what this means is that one of the most important facts about our world, if God exists, which would be the existence of God, that would be revealed to people in some way if God exists. If if atheism is true, it's not at all clear that we would have this similar kind of access to a super important and fundamental fact about the world. So that's what you might call an epistemic consideration. So I know I was saying there's the epistemological question, the axiological question. It does get complicated here, but you could also, there's overlap, but this would actually be under axiology. There's different kinds of value, right? Axiology just means value, it's like we said. So one kind of value is epistemic value. That might then have implications for the epistemology of theism question, but we can ask questions about what's the epistemic value of God's existence? What kind of things could we know or could we not know if God exists? Some planting in stuff might start to ring a bell here, but I do think this idea that there would be divine revelation is a really important epistemic source and a consideration in favor of pro-theism.
Yeah, I think maybe what you were getting as the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, Plantinga has argued that, if you're a naturalist and you believe in evolution, then basically you can't know much of anything because your cognitive faculties, it's a very, very low probability that they would be reliable and reliably produce true beliefs.
And on the positive side, Plantinga argues that if your cognitive faculties are functioning properly, then you can know a bunch of stuff. And he has a story not just about, a lot of it's about theistic belief, but he applies it to like a bunch of areas of other areas of knowledge as well. But then he also argues, and again, this is controversial, that the only way to really spell out the concept of proper function is on a theistic picture. So this would again be an epistemic consideration that is pro-theistic. I know that kind of gets complicated, but yeah.
Yeah. So maybe then it'd be good to transition to what are some considerations in favor of anti-theism?
Yeah, so just to kind of put my cards on the table, I think there's some interesting stuff to be said here, but at least in my opinion, the scales tip much more in favor of pro-theism, but I'll say a few that have been brought up. So one of the biggest ones people talk about is privacy. So they think, look, if God exists, God knows every thought you've ever had. God knows your beliefs, God knows your desires, God knows facts about your body and where your body's been and what you've done and all these facts about your past and who you've interacted with and what terrible things you've done and all this stuff. And so some people think this is a big invasion of privacy. There's certain things that they only want certain people to know, or they maybe don't even want anyone but themselves to know. And so some have argued, Guy Kahane actually sort of pioneered the axiology of theism, and I think this is one of the big things he talks about in that paper, is that sort of God's existence, especially if God is all-knowing and omnipresent, that would violate our right to privacy. So it's kind of an interesting one.
What's his name?
Guy Kahane.
Kahane, I've never heard of Kahane.
Yeah, he's a philosopher at Oxford.
Okay.
So
do you want to give a response to that, or do you want to just leave it out there in the open?
I was actually talking to a few people at the conference about this yesterday. Of course, there's a lot to be said either way, but privacy is interesting. It's interesting to think about. Well, so first, whether we even have a right to privacy at all, but also why we value privacy or what the point of privacy is. And I do
especially if we're thinking about in terms of theism, where this being is perfectly loving and loves you, unconditionally and everything.
Absolutely. And so it's I was just actually thinking about a couple weeks ago when my Facebook got hacked, and it felt really horrible. And I think part of the reason it felt horrible is because it felt like a privacy violation. They could get into all my stuff, and there could even be financial, they could be stealing my money and all this stuff. But the reason that felt so horrible is because it was this person who seemed to have really bad intentions that was trying to take things from me without my consent and all this stuff, and they didn't have my best interests in mind. So it seems like that was bad, but that doesn't seem to apply in the theistic case. God does have our best interests in mind, and in fact, some people have argued if God knows everything we're doing and we're aware of that, that's actually in some ways an important source of accountability or something.
Right.
So you can kind of turn that argument on its head and say, no, it's actually a good thing that we don't have this maximum privacy and these actions that we can take that we'll never be held accountable for. You know. So
I want to do something kind of weird.
Okay.
So Josh Rasmussen's in the room, and I want to ask him if he has any thoughts. He's been paying attention to this whole.
I do, because there is also a model on which
We
God
can't hear you, so you're gonna have to like hop in the set.
Do you want me to like give him
No,
my
don't
mic?
give him the
Okay.
mic. You can.
No,
You just as long as you're close
this
enough.
is all very fascinating. I think because I like to be inclusive, right?
Yeah.
There's also a model on which God's mind allows indeterminacy. So maybe God could voluntarily retreat some conscious attention.
Yeah.
And like that passage, if you draw near to him, he'll draw near to you. Maybe there's some epistemic distance that you could have, and you could actually have a little bit of privacy given to you. And I think this is helpful maybe because if somebody's worried that you can't want that God exists because it would be so bad you'd lose your privacy, well, maybe it's just a certain model of God, right? So the minimal concept of God maybe allows a range of options.
All right, get out of the set, Josh.
I'm out of here.
No, that's good. Well, one reason I like that is because I think in general, a lot of this debate is going to depend on your concept of God, right? And one thing I've pushed is like, look, if God exists, then there's this afterlife, and there's all this pro-theistic stuff in the afterlife, whether that's just in general or even like epistemic stuff, like we can ask God any question. That's super cool, right? But there's still this inference to be made from God's existence to the afterlife. And so you need to be clear what you mean by God, what all you're building into that. An afterlife isn't strictly inconsistent with atheism. I mean, it might be weird, right? But so I think Josh is totally right that getting clear on the concept of God is going to have a lot of implications for whether these considerations actually end up holding water.
Yeah, that's good. So privacy was one. Let's talk about another one. But before we do that, I was just thinking that when Josh came in the set, this is like the CC team.
Oh yeah.
Like the three of us are, you guys are board members. I'm a board member as well on the CC team. But this is it.
That's awesome.
Really cool.
And we're all together in person. This is the first
awesome
time
here.
all three of us have been together in person. That's really cool.
Okay, so getting back to, so that's one consideration in favor of anti-theism. Are there any others that are notable?
There's a couple more. So so remember when we were talking about the problem of evil earlier, and then we said, if you suffer, you're compensated for that, and maybe if you suffer -10, God gives you +20. So it's like maybe you're even overcompensated. Some people have argued that this actually renders morality incoherent. So I could go around and torture people because if I torture you and you get -1,000, then God gives you +2,000 in the afterlife, right? So I'm actually doing you a favor by torturing you when you sort of look at the whole timeline, the grand scheme of things. And that seems totally incoherent. Torturing people's wrong, punching people in the face is wrong. We can't just go around and do whatever we want because God's going to compensate people later. So
my initial thought to that is, and I haven't been like giving my own assessment of things so far, but my initial assessment of that is it seems to assume something like consequentialism about what we should do because you get all these good positive benefits and that's going to guide us in what we should do morally.
Yeah, and even if you give consequences some kind of moral weight, this would have to give them like a very significant amount of moral weight so that could justify things that are very clearly intuitively morally wrong.
Yeah.
And
is that kind of the response that you would give to?
That's definitely one good response. I mean, I also think too, you could just say, we don't know exactly how compensation is going to work.
Okay.
Even if there's some kind of justice, it's just, we shouldn't just bank on like, oh, they're going to be compensated so I can do whatever I want, So I think there's at least some room to say, well, I'm not 100% sure, and that's taking a pretty big risk to like go and torture someone. So, let's slow down a little bit here. So yeah, I think in that case, again, you would be sort of challenging what theism implies, whether it's like, some kind of consequentialism or that like they're all definitely, I have credence one, that they're all compensated in this way. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay. So then what about another consideration? Did you say that there was another one?
Yeah, there's probably a lot. I'm kind of going off the top of my head.
Yeah, let's just do one more.
Okay, so one more. So some people think if God exists and God has total and exhaustive foreknowledge of the future, this compromises or even takes away our free will. So the thought would be, look, if you're going to eat cereal for breakfast tomorrow and you can freely do that, maybe we think initially, but God knows, God even like maybe has credence one that you're going to eat cereal for breakfast tomorrow, then it doesn't seem like you could choose to eat it or not eat it. It seems like there's some kind of fatalist thing going on here where you have to eat cereal for breakfast. There's not really an alternative possibility there. So one potential anti-theistic consideration is if there's a God that has full foreknowledge of the future, that might compromise our free will. In response, I mean, one thing I think to say is like, look, I think you could make a similar argument without even appealing to God at all, whether that's on the basis of either just determinism, that's obviously controversial, or even just there being truth values of these propositions about the future. So, maybe God adds an extra twist that makes that a little more tricky, but in philosophy classes, you'll learn about fatalist arguments that don't appeal to theism at all. So it's not clear to me that this would be a uniquely anti-theistic consideration. I think it's maybe a problem whether
I
you're
see
a
some
theist or
overlap
not.
between the first consideration, the privacy consideration, and this one.
Interesting.
Because when it comes to privacy, what the concern is that there's this bad person looking in on what you're doing or something.
Yeah.
They've got these nefarious intentions. But even if something like, is it called theological fatalism? Even if that's true, who is this person who has determined everything? It's a perfectly good being. And so maybe that kind of lessens the worry a little bit.
Whereas if fatalism's true on atheism, there's no such guarantee that there's some kind of perfect plan that's made for all of our lives. So that's a nice point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, how should we, because I think we're actually at a good time to kind of wrap up the interview.
Yeah.
We wanted to keep these a little bit shorter this time. So what would you like to say to kind of wrap it up, and any last final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one thought, and I'm kind of working on a paper on this right now and still sort of developing my view, but I've talked before about how faith isn't just about whether you believe something or the probability of something, but faith also involves desire. And because of this, I actually think faith and the axiology of theism actually have quite a bit to say to each other. There's a lot of really interesting interactions between these two literatures. And I think more specifically what I'm sort of coming to think, although kind of tentatively, but to really have faith that God exists, so not just to believe that God exists would be just to say there's God and then you can be pro-theist or anti-theist, But when you have faith that God exists and that you have some kind of commitment to God and you've centered your life around God, I think on some level you should judge that God's existence would be a good thing. And that might sound really weird or controversial, and I want to say, look, that doesn't mean that in certain moments you don't desire God not to exist. And that doesn't mean you also don't think there are some drawbacks of theism. But I think seeing God's goodness is a super important part of having faith and a super important part of making that commitment to God. And so I want to say, look, if you have faith, at least on some level, you should think pro-theism is true. And I'm working out the details of that. But I think at least there's some really important connections there.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and end this one out. Thanks for coming here, for being at the Capturing Christianity conference. We didn't really talk about that a whole lot, but this is what we're doing is we've got this conference, CCV1, and you're speaking, is it tomorrow? I believe you've got your main session tomorrow. And we've got a mixer tonight. I'm just so excited. I mean, this is really cool. You mentioned a little bit earlier that you had already met with some of the people who were attending, and you were having some conversations with them.
Some of the Bereans hit me up last night, and we all ate Whataburger on Tyler McNabb's insistence.
Yes.
So.
Okay. So what did you think? I need to know.
I thought it was pretty good.
Is this your first time being at Whataburger?
This is my first time. I've been a huge In-N-Out fan for very dedicated In-N-Out person. Disappointingly, the closest In-N-Out's like half an hour from my hotel. So, but the Whataburger was really close, and I thought it was pretty good.
Okay. What did you order?
I ordered the jalapeno burger.
Okay.
Have you had that?
It's been a while since I've been to Whataburger, actually.
Yeah. Tyler recommended it, so I thought it was pretty good.
Okay.
It was, so it was like, it's
Did you
hard
try the spicy ketchup?
Yeah, it was good. It was good.
Do you like spicy stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not like crazy spicy. Like some people are like, give me the triple 10. And I can't quite go that far, but I'm learning, I'm trying to ease myself into eating more spicy food. So I enjoyed it,
Well, this is definitely a little bit off topic, but it was a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to your talk tomorrow.
Me too. Thanks for all your planning and organizing this. I'm so excited for the conference.
Yeah, we should be thanking Brittany for all of the organizing. She is incredible.
She's been amazing.
Yeah, Brittany's my wife, and she's been planning this whole thing. She is the best. So Brittany, if you're watching this, thank you so much for all of your hard work.
We love you, Brittany.
Yeah. All right, see you guys in the next video.